With the Investing News Network, I'm Scott Tibbles. Today, I'm at the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, and joining me now is Charles Dumbrille. Charles is the Chief Risk Officer at In-D-Tel International. Thanks so much for joining me, Charles.
Thanks for having me again. It's great to be here.
So, of course, you're a risk expert. So, given that in 3 countries that we've talked about fairly recently, in Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Ivory Coast, they're all coming up on an election year. And as listeners will know, those countries are where they're big in gold. So what should an investor with exposure in those countries be thinking about as they head into an election year?
Sure. Well, I can go through those countries. Let's start off with Ghana. It's known as the good kid in the rough neighborhood. It is planned to have its election in November and will most likely move ahead with that for November 2020. Its elections are quite politically polarized. We have the current president that is going against the former president of the country. The current president's name is Akufo Addo, and the past president is a gentleman by the name of Mahama. And the current president's claim to fame is that he's really increased the investment opportunities in the country, has really given a lot of value in the oil industry and in gold. So the policies that he has in place are quite strong for the country to continue on. The former president, who is also a good choice, they're the country's in a good place right now, where either president, if will win, will continue to be stable and continue that growth. The former president has a brother who is also the largest locally owned mining owner in the country. So the former president is wanting to look at regulating illegal mining in the country, which is a big issue, especially for the big producers that have had to stop projects with illegal mining, these GLAMCs that are on these concessions and disrupting the situation. So if he is involved, if he wins, then they'll be clamping down on the illegal mining that we've talked about before in the country. But either way, I think it's a great opportunity in the country where either president, no matter who wins, things will move in a positive upwards direction. So moving on to Burkina Faso, it's a country that has been under a lot of turmoil. It has had a lot of, the market says that the risk has increased quite a bit. Actually, the risk has always been there. It just seems that the market has been ignoring those risks. They have an election planned for November as well. The big question is, will they be able to keep that date? You see in neighboring countries like in Mali that have had recent elections, the militants were attacking the polling stations, the electoral offices, and that really slowed down the process for democracy in that area. So that is a big concern logistically. Is the country able to manage the threats and the security concerns there? The threat and the security situation is migrating more towards the south and the west of the country, so areas that haven't been hit before, or mining companies that like to boast that they haven't had an attack in their region, they most likely will. Sadly, I would not be surprised if there is another attack tomorrow. The concern is declining. The concern is increasing, and the security situation is declining. We have, it's a quite diversified political race, and we still have another 9 to 10 months for that race to come together and to see who will be backing who. It's not like a lot of elections in the West where they have long 2-year campaigns.
And of course, in Burkina Faso, we started 2019 with the news of the Canadian miner losing his life.
Yes, just a year ago, this past weekend, very well-known local geologist.
And what about the Ivory Coast? What about what's happening there?
Now, Ivory Coast is another interesting one. It's quite complex. We have a current president who is in his second term, but the constitution changed for president to only run for 2 terms during his first term. And he is saying that he is allowed to run for another term because that first term did not count. But and he has the support to be able to get away with it. And so there's a likelihood that he'll be running, and his opposition is currently in France by his name is Soro, and he is a former rebel leader. He has the support of the military, where a lot of the rebels are in the military, and the reason that he is in France, Soro is in France, is because there is an arrest warrant for him for an attempted coup attempt. There is no concrete evidence that he did attempt to have a coup in the country, but he did have to flee, and so there is that concern. And again, if he wanted to have a civil war because of the military backing that he has, he could easily do that. And this is not just a hypothetical idea. This is quite possible because the civil war was just 10 years ago.
And of the three countries, which one is the most stable or the most unstable?
Ghana would definitely be. I mean, it's
Ghana's the most stable?
Definitely the most stable, and will continue to be stable. And
there's a lot of Canadian companies there.
And there's a lot of Canadian companies, a lot of gold, there's a lot of oil, there's also cocoa. Ivory Coast and cocoa have also sort of created a cocoa cartel earlier this month as well to help control the price of cocoa.
Okay, and hopping back to the Ivory Coast with that president, what is his argument for saying that his first term doesn't count? He can run again? Because the constitution changed during that first term, so he was in the middle of it, so he doesn't feel that he's had a full He's obliged.
term. Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
But there could be a compromise. There could be multiple situations. So the opposition could be either banned from the election. They could be allowed to come back from France. But they could also offer a position of vice presidential position or prime minister position for him to help ease the tensions and create that compromise. Okay, and moving away from West Africa to another hotspot in geopolitics. So, of course, as everybody will know, unless you've been living under a rock, the year started with a bang with tensions between Iran and the US. There was a reaction with the gold price and a reaction with the oil price, although most of that seems to have wound back in the time since. What are your thoughts on the situation there, and what should an investor be doing to ensure that they're insulated from conflicts like that, even just little blips, or whether or not it turns into something more major? Certainly. Well, it's all watching what the reality is, but also what the market perceives the reality is. Yeah. So you do have these concerns, this heightened alert of everyone talking about World War III, but it's also really finding out what's going on and how things could happen there. So there's multiple situations that could really create another war, could really escalate things. One is stopping the waterways. So the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, with the oil supply chain coming in and out of there. There is that concern, but at the same time, the support in Yemen is not as strong as it was. A lot of the Houthi rebels that were in Yemen have moved inwards and have withdrawn from the coast, so there's still a capability, but not as much capability as there was in the past. So the blockage of the waterways. You've also got a lot of Shiite Iranians that are in the Basra area where the oil terminals are that control the situation in Iraq with the oil in the country. And are those proxies sitting there ready for an attack if needed to help disrupt? There's a lot of political questions involved. Who's leading the country right now? What international foreign influences in the country, and who's in charge, and who's going to call the shots on what's going to happen next. So basically keep an eye on everything going forward. Continually monitoring. It could really go downhill quite quickly. Just be prepared and monitor the market and monitor the situation. Okay. And staying with oil, the situation is continuing to seemingly degrade in Libya. Can you tell me a little bit about the situation there and your thoughts on how an investor approaches Libya, if at all? Certainly. Libya is a very interesting, complex situation. It is It is a conflict that's been going on for many, many years now, but Turkey is getting involved more and more. To generalize it, we have the two organizations, LNA and GNA. LNA is along the east side of the country, the GNA is along the west side of the country. The GNA have signed an MOU with Turkey, gaining their support. The LNA has agreements and support from the Sunnis, so countries like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, in the Gulf states. The concern is that there's also a pipeline that's planned. So right now Europe is relying on its energy a lot from Russia that would be going through Turkey. Turkey would then be able to, has that leverage to be able to control European politics and when they're dealing with Europe. But there's also the concern of another pipeline that's being proposed from Israel through Cyprus through Greece. So there is a MOU between Turkey and the GNA in Libya that is infringing on the territorial waters of Egypt and Greece that would cut right across the Mediterranean and block that pipeline if it is moved forward at all.
And how long has this been developing for? Is this new, or has it been bubbling?
This is fairly new in the past month, so it's quite new.
And I'm assuming that Libya is, of course, still very much in an active war zone, and we don't know who's going to be victorious, if at all.
Yeah, LNA attempted to take the capital, Tripoli, last April. Got on the outskirts of the city, but weren't able to capture it. It's still very much in limbo. LNA has the oil fields in the east, but the terminals are controlled by the GNA. So there's a strangle by LNA not producing the oil, and then they can't also release the oil to the rest of the.
So is there any oil production coming out of Libya at all?
There is. It's very minimal, but this is a stalemate, and this stalemate will continue for the next couple of months, at least.
What companies are exposed in Libya, or is it state-run?
I can't name for sure certain companies, but
there is foreign investment still.
There is foreign investment, yes. Europeans are trying to get as much oil as they can, and so there's a lot of interest in trying to open up that market.
Okay, fantastic. Well then, on that note, I think that we will leave it there. A good update on the situation in West Africa between Iran and the US, and the situation in Libya, which a lot of listeners might not, a lot of listeners may have tuned out of, as it has been bubbling along for almost a decade now. But again, I'm Scott Tibbles with the Investing News Network, and I've been speaking with Charles Dumbrille. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.